It's all well and good for MMT economists to say that the government creates money when it spends. But who are the public going to believe? A bunch of obscure academics, or this guy who's the Treasurer of Australia, who stands up and says, we are going into debt, borrowing money to fund a deficit, and we have to pay it back, and it's a debt we leave to our grandkids. It's very hard to get the message across when the public statements of the government are so at odds with the theory. What I'm going to do is show you how, even with the convoluted system of debt issuance and bond sales that we have set up in order to artificially discipline our spending, you can still see that government spending creates money, or more correctly, that government spending creates net financial assets in the private sector. So here we go. The way that government deficit spending works is that when Treasury has a thing at the RBA called the official public account. The official public account is actually kind of different from other accounts because it's called a consolidated self-executing fund. Basically what that means is that the RBA would never bounce a Treasury check even if it had no money in there. But let's just set that aside for 1 second. The Treasury's account is called the official public account, and the RBA handles that for Treasury. Whenever they tax people, the money is recorded in the official public account, and whenever they spend, that spending is also recorded. If the government wishes to spend without having taxed enough to cover that spending, what it does is it asks the Australian Office of Financial Management to issue a bond, and investors bid on that bond for a price. The money that the investor spends is then transferred to the official public account, and the investor gets a bond. The bond is in the same dollar value as the dollars. The Treasury then spends that money into the economy, maybe hiring someone to do something. So the situation before was that we had one amount of dollars in the investor's bank account, and the situation after the government has spent is that we have this bond, which is worth the same number of dollars, plus the original dollars that we already had before. So the government has deficit spent and has created a bond out of thin air. Okay, so the government has created this financial asset when it's spent. Now, that's a bond, that's not money, you might say. But there's a lot of things about bonds that make them very money-like. And in fact, you could kind of say that bonds are nothing more than reserves on which we have chosen to pay interest. A bond, as I've discussed before, is a lot like a term deposit. It locks money up, but it doesn't change the liability or the balance sheet of the government. So if the RBA conducts, for example, quantitative easing and buys back bonds, all that happens is that the bond gets turned into cash. Also, when the bond matures, all that happens is that the government replaces that bond with cash. The only problem is that we have our system set up so that in order to replace that bond with cash, the government either has to issue another bond or tax someone in order to get the money and give it to the investor. So we've got this system set up where the government could easily just issue reserves, but in order to apply some sort of twisted discipline to government spending, we say that every time the government spends, it has to give an interest-bearing asset to a private investor, and that we make a promise to pay that investor back out of future taxes collected from people who earn their income. It doesn't have to be set up that way, and it's clear to see that the government is creating net financial assets in the public sector when it spends. But the conservatives, the fiscal conservatives, see that by forcing the government to sell bonds to the private sector, they are disciplining government spending. Wouldn't it be better to have our government spending to the public purpose, disciplined by parliamentary, budgetary, and democratic processes, rather than applying this private market, private investor discipline, which artificially constricts how much the government can spend, and has resulted in a fiscal policy that is too contractionary and in fact has produced austerity. the sooner that we the sooner that we stop accepting the line that we are spending, having to borrow in order to spend, and the sooner that we realize that the government could spend in a different way, the sooner we'll be able to set up our system in such a way that we can pursue full employment rather than being terrified about inflation and overspending. Because what we're doing right now is just punishing ourselves and willfully submitting to the fiscal discipline of private investors who should have absolutely no part in deciding how much money the government can spend in the public interest.